Street photography at night is a unique opportunity to capture moments and feelings that we can't capture during daytime. But it was really difficult for me when I started out 5 years ago. And back then it was because of the different camera settings and lighting conditions that we have to adapt to at night. I'll cover these in this video as well, but last week when I went out to take some night photos for this week's video, it felt hard again, but this time for a different reason. My photos were technically correct, but they didn't feel like anything. They felt kind of random and didn't express any emotion. So I took a step back to reflect on what made the photos over the last 5 years that I took at night special to me, and I think I found the answer. So in this video I'm going to cover the settings for night photography, how different lighting conditions impact the feeling of your photos, and my approach to night photography that helps me express my emotions or my curiosity. So let's start with the settings to get a baseline of how we can influence how our photos actually look. So first tip is to shoot in manual mode, because if you're shooting in auto, your camera will try to expose your photo as if it was a daytime scene, meaning it will try to make the dark portions very bright, and this will lead to your bright portions being too bright and overexposed to the point where they'll be completely white and you'll lose any detail in them, like in certain lamps or neon signs and stuff like that. So to prevent that, I shoot in manual mode, and usually I set my ISO to auto with a maximum of 6400, and I'm shooting on the Sony Alpha 7 IV, and I know my camera can handle 6400 ISO. If your camera cannot handle that, of course choose a lower ISO, but usually I don't even get to the point of reaching that ISO because I'm actively using or looking for light sources that are bright enough so I don't have to push my ISO so much. So I think the most images that I'm going to show in this video are somewhere between 500 and 3200 ISO. Okay, next up is aperture. And aperture essentially controls how much light gets into your camera. And the lower the number, the more light comes in, and the higher the number, the less light comes in. So in night photography, you want to usually use the lowest number that your lens can go to. That'll usually be f2.8 if you have a zoom lens, or if you have a prime lens, you probably can go as low as f1.8 or even f1.4. But you don't need an f1.4 lens or 1.8 to shoot at night. 2.8 is totally fine, and many times that I go shooting at night, I use my zoom lens that only goes to f2.8. But there is a drawback to using the lowest f-stop, so the lowest aperture value that you can get. So the trade-off is that the lower the number is, the more unsharp certain portions of your photo get. So whatever your camera doesn't focus on will be more unsharp if you have a low aperture value. Okay, next up is shutter speed. That also controls how much light gets into your camera, and it controls the motion blur of moving objects. And simply put, a high shutter speed allows very little light into your camera and freezes motion. A slower shutter speed, on the other hand, allows more light in, which is what we need in night photography, but it also creates more motion blur. So the key is to find the balance between having a shutter speed that allows enough light in and still freezes motion. And in street photography with people in it, the sweet spot is usually around 1/125th of a second and 1/80th of a second to have the people still sharp and not blurry. If you want to use motion blur, you can of course get your shutter speed a little lower, like 1/30th or even 1/5. But in that case, you of course have to make sure that you're really holding the camera steady. And one tip here is to use burst mode, just to make sure that your shot doesn't get blurry from your camera shake, because whenever you are pressing the shutter button, your camera will shake. It just happens. And with a slow shutter speed, that really impacts the motion blur of your photo. So by using a burst mode and taking continuous photos, you will make sure that maybe the third or fourth shot will be sharp because your camera will not shake at that point. And yeah, if you want to deeper dive into shutter speed and motion blur, I do have an entire video covering that I'll just link in the description. So yeah, check it out after this one if you like. Okay, next up is light and how it impacts the feeling of our photos. So first tip here is to expose for your highlights, because it's easier to recover details from the shadows in editing than it is to recover blown out highlights. And be comfortable with leaving your shadows dark because it's a night scene. And the shadows are supposed to be dark because we are, after all, trying to capture the vibe of night time. Okay, so the first type of lighting scenario is backlighting, and that is when the light source is behind your subject and in front of your camera. That usually creates a silhouette look where your subject kind of looks 2D-like because there's no detail in them if you are exposing for your highlight. And what that does is it creates a kind of dramatic look and adds a sense of mystery to your subject, and it can invoke feelings of loneliness, and it also kind of removes the character of your subject. And that is a totally fine look to go for. I would suggest that you don't overdo it and that you try different lighting scenarios, because I personally feel like only using silhouettes can get kind of old. And again, it makes your photos look more like 2D. And I do like a more 3D look in my photos, which brings me to the next lighting scenario, which is side light, meaning the light source comes from the side of your subject. And that usually gives you a more three-dimensional look to your subject because one side will be lit up and the other side will have more shadows on it, and you will have a kind of gradient of light on your subject that gives it more of a 3D look. And that is a more realistic look that is somewhat what we are used to seeing. So this is a more comfortable look that looks most realistic, I would say. And it also, again, creates kind of more depth in the photo because the light will move from one side to another, and it'll kind of build a kind of gradient from light to dark within your photo that creates this feeling of depth. Last thing for lighting I want to talk about is top light. That is, as the name suggests, when the light comes from above the subject, like from street lamps, for example, and that kind of puts a spotlight on your subject. And if your subject is within that, you'll have dark shadows around your subject, and thus your subject is basically highlighted by the spotlight. And it can make your subject feel like the main character. It can even feel like your subject is on some kind of stage in an abstract way, but still. But what it does really good is separate your subject from the surroundings, and it can also create a feeling of isolation if your subject is alone in this spotlight, and create a sense of mystery if we can't really tell what is behind or in front of our subject. So what I also wanted to talk about is the emotional side of night photography. Because personally, over the last couple of days, I went out to take some photos for this video, and I noticed something. Usually when I went out at night, before I tried to make a video about it, night photography felt really peaceful. Because at night I feel very calm. And that's because I don't have this feeling of having to be productive. Because during daytime I have an office job, and yeah, I'm working. And there's always the feeling of having to be productive and fulfilling certain expectations that others have of me, like my colleagues, and even outside of work. I have friends and family that all have certain expectations. And I feel like at nighttime is one of the only times where I'm only for myself and I don't have to fulfill any expectations, or I don't even have to fulfill expectations that I think others have of me. I think that is the core issue. And photographing at night is kind of the same. It's a decision that I make, that I just go out and explore, and I take photos without any expectations. But when I started taking photos for this video, I noticed that I again get kind of stressed. And I noticed that when I thought about taking photos that I wanted to present, I took worse photos. So I decided, or I realized that I'm just doing it wrong. If I'm trying to take photos for other people or to fulfill expectations of other people, I don't take photos for myself anymore. I take photos for other people. So what I did was to be curious, basically. That is the baseline tip I'm trying to get at. Being curious and taking photos of things that kind of spark my interest. And it can be as mundane as it gets, but that is the good thing, because if you're taking photos of at night, you're probably making the choice. Something prompted you to have the feeling of, I want to go shoot at night. And you don't have to know what that feeling is to express it in your photography. It'll come to you if you stay curious. Anything that you take a photo of will be an expression of whatever you are feeling. And I think this is not only for night photography, this relates to all creative fields and to any kind of photography. But at night, it is actually much easier to express whatever you're feeling, because you only have limited light sources and you can only work at certain places and try to capture whatever you're trying to capture. And the photos that you like most are probably the ones that will express a certain feeling that you have. And again, you don't even have to know what that feeling is. It'll happen if you stay curious and true to yourself. So if you take photos of things that you think look interesting, no matter the likes it'll get, no matter what other people say, if you think it's interesting for yourself and not anybody else, then you will start expressing yourself in your photography. And I think that is the core idea that I want to instill in you, because I only recently noticed that if I'm not doing that, and if I'm not curious, and I'm trying to take photos for other people to present good photos, whatever good photos are, I take worse photos, and I take photos that are not authentic and that are not true to however I'm feeling. But if I stay curious and photograph things that I just noticed, I take photos that I really like and that express myself way better, even if I can't put my finger on what kind of feeling that is. And yeah, sorry for rambling like this, but this is very important for me, because I think that is when we start expressing ourselves instead of taking photos that are deemed Instagram bangers. Although it's fun to take photos that you can upload to Instagram that you feel like will get a lot of attention, because of course that is kind of what your photography deserves and what we kind of want. We want some kind of attention to our photos, but I think the best way to get the right attention, and not everybody's attention, but just the right attention of people who feel the same way we do and who appreciate the same things we do, I think we get that attention when we create with intention and also express ourselves authentically. And that is basically it for night photography. If anything I said was unclear or you have questions, be sure to leave me a comment and I'll get back to you. And other than that, I hope this video helps you create with more intention, and I'll see you next Wednesday.